It always says it's live, and then sometimes it really is, and sometimes it isn't, so I pause. But we'll see if anybody comes by today. Otherwise, I may be riffing again. I didn't end up publishing it anywhere else, although I did mention it to two people. I had a couple of conversations today. I was very happy to continue exploring metamodernism and dialogue with people. Just got out of a very interesting conversation where we were discussing this idea. See, look here, just now. I just felt silly at the beginning of the other video saying, oh, it says it's live, and then sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. Well, I was talking for like 20 seconds, and now here on the live thing, it says that it's restarted and it's counting up again. I don't know if that's real or not, but if it is, that's unreliable. It looks like I've got somebody watching now, so feel free to leave a question or say hi in the chat so I know who you are if you have any questions about metamodernism. Otherwise, I'll be riffing until you come up with a question or somebody else stops by. So the idea I was discussing in a sangha online. A sangha is like a Buddhist church gathering a little bit. And we were discussing this idea that according to Buddhism, there are various states of consciousness that you can be in. And they collapse the various states of consciousness into certain main groups. And the idea is that you can be in the human group of human states of consciousness, you can be in animal consciousness, you can be in something they call hungry ghost, you can be in something called hell states of consciousness, which have pain and that kind of thing. You can be in states of consciousness called God realms or Titan realms. And then the idea is that nirvana is not any of these, but it is a middle way that sort of avoids being any of them. And Buddhism teaches that people should pursue nirvana and come out of the other realms. But the other realms exist, even though nirvana is supposedly the superior way, because they justify themselves somehow, or they sustain themselves. They have patterns that allow them to persist across time. So, part of the idea of things like the Titan realms is that they convince you that you really need to accomplish things. And one of the reasons those patterns persist is because if you try to let them go, you're told that you're clearly only letting them go because you couldn't accomplish things anyway. And so people can sometimes get trapped in Titan realms, and that means they get trapped in these games where they're trying to compete for more and more power, like Game of Thrones. And they sometimes make themselves miserable doing it, but they can't help feeling superior anyway, even though they've made their lives worse because they're gaining power. And they can't let go of the idea that that's sort of the best pragmatic measure of value in this very pragmatic world. On the other hand, although these other realms are considered sort of inferior to nirvana, they have different idiosyncratic shapes because this is all of the shapes, this is all the various mind shapes that can be categorized into some of these 5 or 6 categories. But this includes states of consciousness that include things like people who try to solve problems in the world, like entrepreneurs and sometimes artists or activists and so on. And these states of consciousness persist, among other reasons, because they justify caring about something. They look out in the world, they look at the problems in it, and they actually care. And they decide to try to do something about it. And you can see this expressed really wonderfully in music like Marvin Gaye's What's Going On album, where he has a song called Save the Children, and he sings about who really cares to save a world that is destined to die. And he really emphasizes and uses the music beautifully to emphasize this idea of, but who really cares? I mean, what am I supposed to do? Like, I partially ask that question because I don't want to do anything anyway. And the fact that there's no clear plan for what I would do if I wanted to is a pretty good excuse not to do anything. But would I if there was a plan? If there was a plan that said, hey, we've got a plan to do wonderful things, to reshape the world in a wonderful, effective way. It works as long as we get 1 million volunteers willing to put in, these things. Will you sign up and be one of them? And it's like a bunch of work. It takes work. the world gets better, it's a worthy cause. You can find a lot of meaning in it. It's not necessarily painful. It's good, wholesome labor, but it is a lot of work. Would I sign up to be on a list of that million? And if I would, then I'm probably saying, what would I do for a different reason? It's not that I don't want to know the answer, it's that I just don't know the answer. It seems like a really hard answer to find. What am I supposed to do? Yes, especially since COVID, I've become more and more aware of a list of crises that are threatening the whole planet. And I've become more aware of what appears to be a very concerning civilizational inadequacy to the task at hand. We didn't seem to handle COVID very well, and it looks like we might handle the next COVID even worse. So, if the crises are getting worse and our ability to handle them is getting worse, I don't feel great about how my life and the life of my loved ones is going to go over the next several years, maybe decades, maybe not decades, I don't know. But on some level, this feels very intellectual and abstract. I mean, if I just go about my day, it's a perfectly peaceable, lovable time. The crises aren't actually pounding in the door. Maybe they never will. Maybe everything would just be fine if I ignored everything, pretended nothing was going on, and I would find the world would go on as it always has. Or maybe empires don't last forever. Sometimes they collapse. People think they never collapse, but they do. They can go on for 1,000 years proving that they'll never collapse, and then they do anyway. In our case, we're looking at much younger things with a lot of confidence that they won't collapse. I don't know if that's justified or not. And there's things like AI. I don't know what that's going to do, but I like really, really don't know what it's going to do. Like I don't know what it's going to do to such an extreme degree that it's like changing the way I imagine how reality functions, trying to wrap my head around what it might do. That would change my life so drastically. It's like, I hope not in a horrible way, but even if it goes well, I mean, the incredible, insane ride along the way is going to be crazy. And if it's all destined to go well anyway, then that's maybe okay because I'll be freaking out. Well, I'll be freaking out and it'll just come together nicely at the end. Or maybe it'll be going crazy and the situation will require us to at least somewhat competently direct our intelligence and our resources and our virtue toward handling the crazy, insane changes going on in the world. And if we completely fail, maybe even if we do as well as we did handling COVID, maybe that's not good enough and the thing spirals out of control one way or another. And so maybe we need to be prepared to exercise some modicum of wisdom, even in the situation where AI is advancing at such a fast rate that we barely know what real even means in the world anymore, or how to navigate a world where you can't know the truth. Civilizational collapse, empire collapse, AI. Some people think climate change is the one that's going to come knocking on the door soonest, but I think of that as a relatively long term problem, especially given that I live in a place of geographical privilege with respect to that kind of thing. But then there's wars that, of course, can be very threatening with nukes and drones, and then there's potential pandemics. I mean, COVID was like a baby pandemic compared to what we could have. So I'm not going to just keep going into all of these. There's tons of crises, right? Would I like the world not to go badly? Sure. Is it going to go badly? Maybe, but maybe it'll just be fine. Maybe I want to think that because that's what's always happened anyway. On the other hand, that's happened always. Yeah, I mean, did you want to live through the collapse of the Roman Empire? Just because it happened and the species survived doesn't mean that a lot of people along the way didn't suffer in ways that utterly devastated their lives and the lives of their families and loved ones. It's like the Holocaust. It's like, sure, we exist still on the other side of it, but wouldn't you wish there was something you could do if you could foresee this kind of impending crisis or meta crisis? So I was just talking at this Sangha, and I was saying, hey, look, I know the standard teaching is that nirvana is the way to go, but what if I was a heretic and I didn't listen to that, and I said, I want to know which realm, which state of consciousness is best for helping a species coordinate, cooperate harmoniously, and level up in coordination and something like species-wide intelligence, so that it could get its act together and solve its meta crisis, whatever its collection of problems happen to be, before whatever deadline their particular meta crisis was imposing upon them. When does the first crisis hit hard enough for you to wish you'd really, really, really tried a lot sooner before things got so bad? I don't know how long that is, but it might be too late to stop it, even if we do direct our resources at it. Like, we could actually get together and try and solve some of these problems and discover that they're just too difficult. But we're not even doing that. So there's little point, there's really very little point in thinking about the particulars of how we might or might not be able to solve some of these problems right now, when we aren't even civilizationally capable as a species of directing our resources at our problems in a halfway competent way. And in fact, the I don't want to say obsession because it's so proper in some sense, but the focus on answering, on studying how to solve specific problems, when we know perfectly well that one, probably our research initiatives, many of them are going to fail, at least the way they are right now. We need something better than this, and we don't know where to find it. And two, even if this one works on this crisis, several other crises are probably going to get worse in the meanwhile. So you're just living in a world where you're doing your best and you expect your best to fail and for some crisis to come knocking on your door once it's your turn. So we face this meta crisis, and it's not really helpful to make ourselves too anxious with tracking the ups and downs and scene by scene developments of each on a list of crises of potential global magnitude. We don't need to do this. This is a poor use of time. It does not allow us to coordinate as a species to take care of this problem. What we need to do is not run away from the fear of acknowledging our inadequacy to the task before us, but embrace it and say the first step here is acknowledging we have a problem as a species. Humanity's problem as a species is that it causes problems faster than it solves them. It can't get itself out of the hole it's dug for itself because its its processes for getting out of holes make the hole even deeper along the way. So it should stop digging. It's only digging itself in deeper. It should stop digging and focus on reshaping itself to be a better digger or whatever, more capable of digging itself out of the hole, less likely to dig itself deeper in the process of doing so. We need to direct our collective attention at that target and say, why can't we coordinate as a species? And collectively, a few of us at first, and hopefully more and more of us, look at that and try to answer it and fail together. We want more and more people to be failing together in harmony at figuring out and answering why we can't coordinate effectively as a species. Now, of course, there are levels of coordination. So you might say, well, we are coordinating better than ever before, even in some ways. It's like, yes, well, let's be specific about a standard then. Why can't we coordinate well enough that we could do communism and have it work? Or we could do capitalism and have it work. Either one would work because we as a species would just coordinate well enough to take care of our problems, regardless of what system was being used to sort of help organize us at certain levels. We're not at that level. I don't believe we could do communism and shouldn't attempt to impose it, given that we're not capable of it. But if we could do communism, I believe it would probably be the case at that point that it would barely matter whether we did it or not. Once we were capable of doing it, we'd already be taking care of each other pretty well, such that if we did transition over to communism, it would be a pretty smooth transition. So, coordinating well enough as a species that whether we have communist or capitalist paradigms, we do a halfway decent job of managing our problems and taking care of each other anyway. And on the other hand, we want to be intelligent enough to direct our resources at our problems. Right? I don't think that's too crazy of a standard to point at. Are we coordinated? Sure. Are we coordinated enough for humanity to notice what its big problems are and direct its resources at them? Brain power and body power. And I don't know, you could call it heart power or whatever. Are we directing our resources as a species at our problems? Well, no. So we've got a long way to go. And as simple as this might sound, it's actually basically never happened. So it's apparently pretty difficult. Hmm. So if one step is to start failing at answering how we can coordinate together. Part of the reason that works is because to fail at it is to be at least looking at the target. And there's certain kinds of coordination that happen just from knowing that you're looking at the same shared target together. That's one of the reasons rituals are powerful, because you know that everybody who's participated in that ritual has had their attention moved through the same steps. Maybe we should come up with a ritual where we include aiming at the target of saying, how can we get better coordination as a species such that we can direct our resources at our problems? Generating a failed attempt at a solution. And if we've got a bunch of those, then we start talking, we start dialoguing. We shove the dialectic through at top speed. We look at all the ideas for how to go about kicking off coordination. We do our best to find the good ones and weed out the bad ones and combine the insights, and sometimes even combining the mistakes, to generate a second generation of insights after that. And that second generation of insights, those particular insights were out there in knowledge space, waiting for us to discover them once we thought of them. But they're two generations away from where we are today. So it sort of makes sense that, first we compare all of our first failed answers. And only in the middle of that dialogue of comparing specific insights and ideas do we generate the second generation of insights. The right answer is out there somewhere. We don't know what it is. Some answer would work, presumably. We don't know where it is. We could theoretically hope somebody will just go from wherever we are right now and just jump straight to it, come to some incredible intuitive lightning bolt of insight and say, aha, and say, here's what we do, everybody. And then we just do it. And we solve a bunch of our problems and we live the best lives ever. Just like, a lot of our ancestors, they lived better lives than their parents, better and better and better and better. And we've been having the best lives ever as a species. And let's continue that. And let's partially be concerned about what might happen if we don't learn to coordinate, but let's also be drawn toward the shared vision of the world we could have together if we did even not very impressive feats of human coordination. If we just leveled up to the basic level of directing our resources as a species at our problems as a species, that would not only solve many of our big problems and developing crises, or at least increase the chance that we'd be able to solve them or manage them, but it would probably simultaneously raise our standard of living in wonderful ways. And AI has such immense productivity abilities that if we use the resources that it creates to take care of the problems that people have around the world, one way or another, if we do that, we probably have so much plenty that everybody could have plenty, that we could have immense amounts of free time and time to spend making each other's lives wonderful. And there's a lot of people who would be willing to make that handshake if the world was arranged such that it were possible. But we have to build our lives around sustaining our productivity and going to work and running our governments and so forth. But we could live better worlds than that. And it's not fanciful because we have vastly, radically new, powerful technology that's going to change the world in unimaginable ways over the next few years. And if we handle it right, it might be able to transform the world in ways that just makes everything so much better for everyone and relieves so much stress and unnecessary pain and allows us to live like only the most privileged people have been able to so far. These are possibilities. So it's partially about averting the meta crisis, but it's also about understanding that, hey, now that we realize that there are certain crises that we all share in common as a species, and there's a certain one size fits all tool for all of them, well coordinated human intelligence and skill, directed with genuine good faith intent at making the world better for everyone. We've done it before. There was a period in American history, for certain, where we were all living in a world that was getting richer and richer around us, palpably, practically on a year by year basis. And you'd go into work and you'd clock in and you'd clock out. And it wasn't just about how enjoyable the work was or something. It was about the fact that you knew, you thought you knew, you were embedded in a narrative that knew that you were participating in a vast civilization building effort that was making everything better for everyone. And you could see the world getting better around you. And even though you didn't directly see your contribution, you didn't have to, because you could perceive it in the abstract. Our contribution, the palpable results. That was inspiring. And it was a shared thing that people could aim at together. That was sort of a positive, optimistic, modernist sort of vision before postmodernism sort of came along and deconstructed a lot of the a lot of justifiable criticisms to be levied against that very sort of optimistic vision of things, the past, present, and the future. But I think we took for granted that a worker was X amount of productive and Y amount of trustworthy, and an employer was Z amount of benevolent. And as postmodernism has eroded the shared narrative, and as the world does not necessarily look like it's getting better, and we don't feel like our work is actually making the world a better place, and so we sort of clock out, check out, put in the minimum, don't derive much meaning from it, but feel compelled to do it anyway for economic reasons. Those old expectations about what it meant to be a worker and what it meant to be an employer are different. If you take out the shared vision, you can't keep everything else the same. Productivity per worker goes down, trustworthiness per worker goes down, corruption among the employers goes up. The shared narrative is doing genuine heavy lifting. These things are neglected because they're subtle, because you can't really measure them concretely. But that doesn't mean they're not real and of extreme pragmatic importance. I read in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich that among the main military considerations Hitler made in his analysis of Britain was that it had a great spiritual strength, which he thought would make it much more difficult to conquer. I believe he would have said America had a similar or perhaps even greater spiritual strength at the time. And America was a place of it was basically the best place in the world for a good while. And it wasn't like a tiny place. Like there's a good chunk of tiny little countries now with higher GDP per capita than America. Maybe some of some size. But at first it was just a bunch of tiny ones. And it's like that doesn't really count. But in America it was like, wow, the third largest country on the planet was so wealthy. It was like the best place in the world. And the people had a wonderful shared vision and an optimism. They didn't always appreciate it. They didn't realize how good they had it, but things were better there than in almost anywhere else. And so, even if people complained a lot, they took for granted certain things. How bad could it get really? Well, no, here obviously we're going to take for granted that we're safe militarily. It's like, do you know how many people around the world get to just take that for granted and have been able to do so for so long and for so many reasons and by such an overwhelming margin? It's really quite something. But I think it also had a shadow, and that was that around the same time, everything was getting better in other ways. No wonder the modernist time seemed so utopic and optimistic about the future. You know, medicines were coming out. We were curing diseases, ending diseases. Vaccines wiped out pandemics for several decades. And then we got used to it because we had this utopic vision that like it was just going to get better and better forever. And what we found out was no, for a brief moment in history, we managed to achieve a reprieve from what was the absolutely normal state of affairs for like forever, which was regular pandemics and like suffering in ways that, what was it? Like a sixth of women just dying in childbirth and like half your children dying before they turned 18. What we think of as utterly world upending disasters by today's standards were the regular state of affairs for pretty much all of human history. And the shadow of that is that we thought we could just keep putting off the real confrontation with the burdens of life and existence. You're growing up in a period where everything's getting better and science is technology and medicine is. Most people didn't really believe they were going to live forever, but they thought they'd live a good long life. The idea became that old age, that if you died in old age, that was okay. That somehow that kind of death wouldn't be too horrible. You didn't really need to think about it too much or prepare for it. You could live a good life and then death would be easy. But, and a lot of them thought they were going to heaven when they died. But being able to have some comfort about where you go when you're dead doesn't actually change that you have to go through the process of dying, which means your health has to degrade so far that it literally can't even sustain life anymore. So one way or another, it happens, and maybe we say, "Oh, passed away peacefully in his sleep." It's like, okay, what about leading up to that? Somehow the health must have gotten so poor that that would happen. So it's a burdensome thing. It's one of the like two, three. It's the main things the Buddha talks about when he comes out of his privileged palace where he's never seen the horrors of reality before, and he sees a sick person, and he's like, "What's that?" And they're like, "Sickness." And he's like, "Does this happen to everybody?" And they're like, "Yeah, pretty much actually." And he's like, "Whoa." And then he sees the second bird, and he sees an aged, bent, withered man, and he's like, "What's that?" He's like, "This is aging." He's like, "This happens to everybody?" And he's like, "Yep." And then he sees a funeral and a dead person, and he's like, "Wait," and then that happens, and they're like, "Yep." And the Buddha's like, "Dude, life is hardcore. I don't know what to do about this. I don't think I'm satisfied to chill in my palatial estate when this is what's going to happen to me." the money won't stop it. It might allow me to get into old age, and then I'll go through it anyway. And then if that's going to happen anyway, then what do I do with my life? Is the best way to spend it, chilling out at the palatial estate? Well, he went. He went in search of answers and the end of suffering. And the standard Buddhist paradigm, if I can come back to this again, says that the thing to do is to attain the state of nirvana, basically, a certain state of consciousness, of peace, joy, love, and also non attachment, cosmic transcendence of material experience. But, hmm. But although Buddha says it's heresy to ask this question, can we ask anyway? Is that the state of consciousness best for transforming the world? Because supposedly a bunch of people have been enlightened and they haven't gotten us, they haven't been able to bootstrap from there to us being sufficiently coordinated as a species to take care of our problems, whether under capitalist or communist paradigms, or avert the incoming meta crisis. So that's apparently not enough. So, is there some other state of consciousness which might be more effective for, let's say, averting the meta crisis on Earth starting 2024? And the Buddha's answer might be that's not the right state of consciousness. You should be pursuing nirvana. And you're like, yeah, but I want to do it anyway. And he's like, you're attached to these worldly outcomes. You care whether there's a Holocaust or not. It's like, yes, I do. Will you tell me? And the Buddha's like, that's not the way. And it's like, okay, well, will you indulge me and tell me anyway? What would the Buddha say? What did the Buddha know? The Buddha said that everything he taught was like a handful of leaves, and everything he didn't teach was like a forest behind him. So we theorized a little bit about what a state of consciousness might look like if it was aimed not at nirvana, not at right thinking or right action or the Dharma, but it was aimed at being good at solving the meta crisis or something. It's becoming an increasingly common experience to bump up against questions where the answer is hard to see. My hope is that looking at the right question and failing and trying to answer it is a step forward. So here I am in this thing. I advertised it in a meeting the other day, and I told two other people about it, and nobody's come. Yesterday, I talked a lot about how I was sort of just jumping into the thing, didn't want to spend a lot of time preparing, planning, optimizing, hadn't really advertised it. And so I thought about it more, and now I've an opportunity to think about it again. And the question is, one way to think about the question in a little bit the Christian paradigm is that, Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like leaven put into a few loaves of dough. And then leaven is like yeast. And he says, and then it spreads to fill them all. And then they grow themselves. But in empirical practice, that's not what happened with the kingdom of heaven, did it? This was more or less the Mormon critique. Joseph Smith was like, the kingdom of heaven was supposed to spread like leaven to fill all the dough, and it spread for a bit, and then it stopped. And sure, it's the biggest religion in the world, but that's not all the loaves now, is it? And also, If it stopped spreading, does that mean that it wasn't the right spirit? In which case, even the Christians today, even though it is the largest religion in some sense, are not in touch with the same spirit that was present at the time of Christ and with its apostles, because it doesn't really look like the same spirit. And the question is, okay, so why doesn't it spread like into the loaves, like Christ says? There's a passage in the Gospel of Thomas, which is non-canonical, but Christ says something like, "Behold, I have set a fire, and I'm guarding it until it blazes." And when he leaves in the New Testament, canonically, he supposedly says, "Hey, go preach the gospel to every nation on earth, every people, every tongue, and I'll come back quickly. Watch, I'm coming back quickly." And then we have reasons to explain why it's been thousands of years and he's not back and it's still coming quickly. And also why the gospel's been more or less, at least sort of preached, probably kind of everywhere now. But it didn't spread to fill all the loaves. Not only did most people not accept it, but also the version of it that spread as far as it did doesn't seem quite the same. And it took a very, very long time to happen. And so the whole becoming quickly thing doesn't make any sense. What about the fire that was supposed to blaze? It almost seems like Christ's idea was for the kingdom of heaven to spread really rapidly, to fill the whole earth and bring things to a resolution pretty quickly. And instead, it started growing explosively, and then something went wrong and it fizzled out. So, in the Christian paradigm, you might blame this on something like the spirit of the Antichrist. You would not be in the Christian paradigm if you said something like, Christ didn't account for the spirit of the Antichrist. That doesn't make any sense in the Christian paradigm. But you could say something like Christ thought it was going to work quickly, and then it failed because he was right that his pattern was one that could spread exponentially to fill the world. What he didn't account for was that his pattern would call into existence and salience the opposite pattern. And that once the opposite pattern was acting, his own pattern and the opposite pattern would meet and mix and fight in some sense. And the explosive runaway success of the spirit of Logos or the unifying spirit of Christ or something wouldn't spread and fill all the loaves like it was supposed to. Now, if this was the idea, if it really was the case that Jesus meant, yep, I'm coming back quickly, and John was like the youngest apostle, maybe, and maybe lived to be the oldest, and he wrote the book of Revelation quite later on in life. And if this were the case, then John would be like, huh, we thought it was going to spread like wildfire. He was supposed to come back quickly. Neither of those things have happened. What went wrong? And then he writes the book of Revelation. He thinks about what I would compare to Isaac Asimov's Foundation series and psychohistory. It's the idea that with the right principles of analysis, you could theoretically analyze history well enough to do something sort of like prophecy. And in Isaac Asimov, it's strictly science. And in John, the apostle writing the book of Revelation, the claim, of course, in the Christian paradigm, is that he was inspired by the Spirit of God, and it's the Word of God. But one way or another, he wrote this document. And I don't know if this interpretation has been made before, but I would a little bit say that if John was trying to figure out why it hadn't spread like wildfire, and then he thought he realized it was because of something like the oppositional spirit of Antichrist, And then he thought, okay, now what's going to happen now that both spirits are reacting together in the world? And you just run that forward in time, and eventually, what? What does it lead to? And so he writes the story of how the spirit of Christ and the spirit of Antichrist spiral outward, one harmonizing the world in the name of harmony and unity and love, and one not harmonizing the world, but unifying it nonetheless with conformity and tyranny, but both uniting the world until we have a globally integrated species, at which point the two spirits come to a head. They don't have space to keep spreading, and so they hit the borders and then they react inwardly. And that's when the reaction, you can almost think of this chemically or alchemically, the reaction reaches its final result. And the claim is that there's a brief period at the end where tyranny really hits its peak, 3.5 years of the last days and all this. And then finally, the Spirit of Christ inevitably wins. And then that's the idea that spreads like fire throughout the world, and people are rapidly unified and coordinated. This has been discussed by people like Alex Zhu. I think he discussed it with like Chris Lakin. And Alex talked about what he called the distributed second coming of Christ consciousness, which is the idea that being that Christ saying he will come quickly. What he really means is that I am in the Father is in me, and I have prayed to the Father in the intercessory prayer that they, others, my followers, will be in me as I am in them. And so the Spirit of Christ, in some sense, was present in the apostles, or was supposed to be. And when the whole spirits finally finish mixing, the idea is that everybody will sort of access that state of consciousness again, the Spirit of Christ that the apostles had, and that Christ wanted everybody to have. And then finally it's done, it happened. Maybe not everybody accepts it in some sense, so there's that whole judgment idea. But the point is, eventually, the Spirit of Christ does finish unifying and harmonizing and bringing people together into a body of Christ. That fits nicely with how Paul describes the whole church as the body of Christ. So when Christ comes back and his body is on earth, one way to say that is everybody's unified and playing their unique role in the body of Christ, and now his body is returned. That's what Alex might call the distributed second coming of Christ consciousness. But then you could say that Christ would have a sort of bodily presence on the earth and would do what Christ did, and that would be to improve the world and build the kingdom of heaven materially around. And so, once we finish getting our act together and coordinating harmoniously as a species, what do? Is we turn around to the world and we fix it. We bring it into harmony with principles that favor everyone and everything up and down the layers. So that's a not entirely original or unique take on how the Christian paradigm can fit in with this sort of metamodern transition in consciousness, where our species becomes self-aware at a global layer. We become a real human superorganism in a certain way for the first time. Was this already understood by Christ, by John? I don't know. Maybe something like it. There are certain principles in common that suggest that Muhammad understood these sorts of things. And you can see that the religion, Islam, has a strong unifying principle for sure. This is actually what is said about it in Life of Pi, which is a great book about a young Indian boy who accepts Hinduism from growing up in India, but sort of has a academic, science, rational sort of perspective from his father, but then accepts Islam and Christianity and belongs to three religions, plus having the materialist paradigm in mind. And what he says about Islam in particular is that he challenges anybody to understand Islam and its brotherhood and deny that there is something of God in it. It's a very interesting book, and I would say a metamodern one. And the way he has the three religions is interesting because the standard response to that is to say that he clearly doesn't understand religion. He doesn't get it in a deep and important way. You can't have these three contradictory religions in common. But then he goes through a horrible, painful, long period of suffering, a life raft with a tiger. And as he goes through the extreme suffering and experiences of human experience and nearly succumbs so many ways and in so many times and reaches his limits and gives up and basically expects death and then realizes that life goes on and sometimes he has to fight for it and all of this. And he gets to the end and he barely made it, let's say because of the religions that brought him comfort and guidance and frameworks for interpreting what was going on. And you're supposed to say to him that he clearly doesn't understand what religion is about, that he's misunderstanding it deeply and profoundly if he thinks that he's related to it in the right way by surviving extreme suffering and finding some way of both finding strength to meet it and even something like perspective to redeem it and find something valuable in it. It's said of Life of Pi that the story is one that will make you believe in God. And so what you're expecting is a story that shows some sort of impossible thing happening that proves only God could have made this happen. But when you get to the end of the story, he just says, well, which story is better? And he says, thus it goes with God. That there is something more profound than mere wishful thinking and desperation. That you find when you are driven to look where we are all driven to look when life presses hard enough, which is what would we believe if we had to believe whatever we had to believe just to get by? There's a spectrum of that. You make compromises of certain kinds, sometimes small, sometimes big, but they're there. And the question is, well, what are the extreme ends of that spectrum? What do the extreme ends of that continuum look like? On one end, what does it look like to have somebody who, by the most convoluted series of unfortunate events, suffered what maximally shaped what he needed to experience believing in as pragmatic a way as possible. It was as little about the truth of the beliefs as ever, and it was as much about their ability to allow him to pragmatically cope with the suffering of life as ever, as you can imagine. If you take that extreme case, sort of exotic state of consciousness, and you can ask and say, would it just be wishful fairy tales? Or would there be something interesting about the maximally pragmatic belief set that when you compared it to what was theoretically the maximally truthful belief set, there were interesting correspondences? What is the ultimate meaning of that? I don't know, because the dialectic hasn't advanced far enough to have the answers, and I can't figure them out without it doing it for me. But I think there's something actually a big deal about saying that there are interesting things to be thought about when you compare pragmatic belief sets and truthful belief sets in their extreme versions to each other. And it seems like on some level, you could even map some version of this onto left and right hemispheres of the brain. Or maybe it's not even a left right hemisphere thing, but it's sort of a binary part of us. Or I'll describe it this way, no more caveats, just onto the model, pragmatically. Some part of you wants to know whatever it needs to know to deal pragmatically with the situation in any given moment. That often means the truth, and it often should mean the truth if it were being wise. And on the other hand, there's a part of you that wants to feel good in your moment. You want to feel beauty, you want to feel love, acceptance, peace, you want to feel okay, you don't want to suffer. And these two are often polling against each other in some sense. Is that the left and right hemisphere? I don't know, but it's something within you. And when these poll and one gains a victory at the expense of the other, things often go badly. There's a very slow, negotiated ascendance in consciousness because the two different perspectives can't value handshake. They can't coordinate. You might, in some sense, map this onto the masculine and feminine and say the masculine part of you wants to be able to grip reality with maximum efficacious control and make it as heavenly as possible. And the feminine part of you wants to feel that the world as it is right now is as heavenly as possible. And so one part of you wants to say, hey, the world can be better, let's change it. And one part of you wants to say, no, the world's fine as it is. And in the interplay between those two, you get the interplay between preserving what you've already got figured out as an organism and exploring around the periphery what you haven't figured out yet. And this can also be an incremental process. But again, the idea is that with the right values handshake, you can get a runaway integration process. And the answer is if you want a runaway integration process, you have to deserve a runaway integration process. And to deserve a runaway integration process, both values must be willing to submit their personal preferences, their personal utility functions or versions of heaven under the banner of something like mutual goodness. And the one says, I want to feel as good about the moment as I can, as long as it's for the mutual good. And if there's a moment where there's something I could take it and I could feel better about the moment as it is, but it wouldn't be for the mutual good. It'd be for my good, and I'd be perfectly within my rights to enjoy it. It's not for everybody's good, but I don't have to worry about them. But if I make that choice, I break the pact. And if I make the pact that I won't pluck that fruit, harvest that opportunity, unless it's for the common good, then in theory, I limit how much I get because however much is available, some of it I'm not allowed to take. But if I make that deal in at the same time as the other value system, I want to be able to see the truth of situation and to be able to navigate it effectively and have some amount of control and optimization power over it and myself. And when I see an opportunity to grip the reality, to get what I want, to exploit something, I will take it, but only if it's for the common good. If it offends that which prefers beauty and acceptance, then I will forego, even though I'm within my rights to take it. And if both sides agree to this, then both sides have theoretically limited what they can take from the environment for their own individual well-being. And yet, and yet, if they can mutually trust each other to submit their personal values to the mutual good, then they can trust each other to rapidly go from where they are, eat, consume whatever's available according to their various value systems, and then rapidly integrate deeper and not have to slow down to spot check for potential betrayals or anything because the other side isn't going to pluck the fruit, even though it's right there and really available and juicy and tempting. You trust, hopefully, based off of a track record, so that the trust is merited. You trust that you can let them in rapidly and integrate really quickly, and they'll let you in rapidly and you can integrate really quickly because both of you trust that the other will only consume that which is of mutual benefit, even though they're tempted to do otherwise. And so mutually aiming at goodness seems like a loser's game because moment by moment you get less value out of each situation. But you get such an increase in speed through the integration process that you got 90% out of the value in frame 1 and I only got 50% of it. But I'm at frame 10 by the time you've figured out how to maximally optimize the negotiation of frame 1. Took you all day. You got 90%. You did a lot better than me. You looked a lot cooler than me, frankly. And if you just put up your performance against mine, I look like the fool. The secret is, in the shadow of that, is I did frames 2 through 10 while you were busy optimizing, and I only got 50% in each of those two. But 50% is a heck of a lot better than your 190%. And so the game is something like embracing the runaway dynamics allowed by goodness, sacrificing the temporary increases that can be enjoyed by reneging on that deal, relying on speed rather than excellence in a given situation in order to gain greater absolute value across time rather than greater relative value within a given circumstance or context or game. And on some level, you can compare this to the choice between seeking your own personal absolute value or seeking your own personal relative value. If you seek your own relative value at the sacrifice of your absolute value, then your absolute value will go down, won't it? You may or may not, it may trigger you to even lose relative value, in which case it's just horrible all around. But it might be that that it works, that you do gain in relative position at the cost of absolute value. And in the extreme success case, you can end up all the way on the very throne of the highest, but you'll still have lower absolute value. And so the question is, do you care so much about your position in the hierarchy that you would literally rather have lower absolute value for the sake of increasing your relative value? Do you really care so much about sitting on the throne that you would prefer to rule in hell and in personal suffering than to be in heaven and have a wonderful time, but you're not actually the number one most powerful person in charge? And yes, there's somebody above you and there's somebody below you, let's suppose. And you learn to treat the one below you with the same dignity that the one above you treats you with. And so you have, I don't know if this is really what Christianity was about, but it seems like it, on some level, could have been trying to describe a way to build the kingdom of heaven on earth as fast as possible. And it could have even gone really quickly in potential, but in our case, it didn't happen very quickly. But maybe this is getting a little bit fanciful, but I like the hypotheses that this framework generates. So I like it for that purpose at the very least. Maybe it's like we are an unusually intellectually advanced species to have still not figured out coordination. We're like so intellectually advanced as a species that we've built technology that might destroy us before we figure out how to even coordinate as a species. In principle, a vastly less intelligent species could theoretically figure out coordination better than us because it's not all about intelligence. And if they were really well coordinated, they might outcompete us just by being able to trust each other and earn that trust and do amazing feats of collective intelligence, like aim their resources at their problems. And we'd look cooler one by one and be smarter one by one, but our inability to collectively coordinate might make us less efficacious as a species. And we might even, there's this idea of filters that keep species from spreading out among the stars. And one is, well, maybe you nuke yourself out of existence, or maybe you make an AI that replaces you. If we are an unusually intellectually advanced species to have still not figured out how to actually enact coordination, even though we've already known it would help for thousands of years, but we still can't get ourselves to actually do it, then maybe our unique path to finally figuring it out is to embrace our unusually intellectually biased orientation and say, can we just try to precisely describe the game theoretical process here by which the right articulated spirit can theoretically take off in a runaway process, um, by facilitating harmonious, good faith handshakes between every member of the organism. And the leaven quickly spreads throughout the three loaves. The fire blazes. Uh, if the vague gesturings of religion and inspirational examples have not been sufficient to make this happen, perhaps a precise, clear map would do. And any religion that claims to have the truth claims to have something that perhaps could be theoretically derived independently of the religion, then. Because if it's just true, it's waiting there to be discovered. And if we discover it via new means, then we can describe it using new paradigms. And if it lines up partially or well enough for us to get along at a deeper level, well, then that's sort of the whole point, is to help us coordinate as a species. And maybe if you buy into the whole fruits of the Spirit, that is what it would really mean to have the Spirit of God on earth, is we would be unified in heart and mind, and we would embrace our individuality and our group nature at the same time. And we would live in as wonderful lives as we were capable of building for each other, which is like a lot better than what we're doing right now. So maybe our pathway forward here is to intellectually describe as precisely as we can through a dialogue of smart people the mimetic structure that would theoretically allow everything to get better for everyone at the same time. And although some other timeline version of ourselves or another species might be able to just sort of intuit and feel their way to coordinating because you can tell it'll just work if we can trust each other and they get there that way. Maybe we have to just articulate it really precisely. And so people only get the necessary trust and faith to be able to do this when it can be seen clearly rather than through a glass darkly, vaguely felt. So I don't know if that's really possible, but if we start trying to answer it, we may find that we make some headway. And I have genuine hope that we can do things like establish a shared narrative and positive vision for the future together and genuinely work together better because we have that vision and before we didn't. And it makes an actual difference to have those sorts of subtle things in place. And if we keep our eye on the target of better coordination and keep investigating the shadow of what might go wrong in that pursuit, then maybe we really can make high leverage moves in the world that will kick off more and more coordinating behavior. And if we do a shotgun approach of that, maybe one of them will spiral up well enough to help us coordinate globally. And if we just keep aiming at better coordination, we'll eventually become the more competent version of humanity that is capable of digging itself out of the hole that we've dug ourselves into. So it's been an hour. Nobody showed up again. Good to just think things through out loud. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Maybe I'll post it in a few chats or groups or Reddits or something. Um, I guess I'll just end it like that. Ta-da!